This is Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work, responding to another AskProfWolff question sent in by our Patreon community, and in this case, by Adrian O'Connor. Adrian asks whether the 1920s, that roaring so-called period just before the Great Crash, shows any similarities with our times now, in terms particularly of scapegoating immigrants, particularly by leading politicians. It's always useful to look at historical parallels. They're full of suggestions, hints, ways to look at our own situation that offer many insights, and this is no exception. Briefly, to respond to Adrian's question. Yes, the 1920s were a time of scapegoating immigrants. A famous law was passed in 1924 that rigidly restricted the flow of immigrants. There was particular hostility to immigrants from the southern parts of Europe, Greeks, Italians, Spaniards, and so on, and likewise an enormous increase in hostility to Chinese immigration on the West Coast, and so on. And politicians, I remember particularly the Republican President Warren Harding coining the phrase "America First," just in case you thought Mr. Trump invented that. America First was his slogan in his campaign in the 1920s. So the short answer is yes. Let me expand briefly, though, on it. World War I was a very major change in the United States. The relative isolation of the Western Hemisphere from the problems of Europe was over. A war that was basically begun and focused on Europe drew the United States in. The United States lent its allies the money. It provided its allies with a good bit of the war materiel to fight the war. And as a result of the war being devastating for all of Europe, it left the United States not only untouched by the war in terms of fighting on our soil, etc., but also left the United States in a new position. It was the great creditor of the rest of the world, whereas before it had been a relatively poorer debtor nation. The rise of the United States to world power really was the fruit of World War I, as it would again be at the end of and as a result of World War II. The wars among the Europeans ended the dominance of Europe and opened the way for the dominance of the United States and then later China and so forth. And I think those periods in the 1920s are also like ours in the following sense. Life was changing. The farm was disappearing as a source of livelihood for millions of Americans who were forced by the collapse of the farms, their replacement by larger and larger farms, which eventually would be called agribusinesses. Were pushing more of them out of their jobs, out of their farming way of life, forcing them into the cities where they were a bit of a stranger because the cities had become the locus of the waves of immigrants who came mostly from Europe and settled mostly in coastal cities, but other cities as well. The rush of population going to the cities where there were at least tenements and apartments. Rural parts of the United States couldn't and didn't absorb very many of them, and so on. And everything changed after World War I. First of all, there were the hundreds of thousands who returned who had been shaped by the war, deeply troubled by the war and the war experiences. Then there were all the economic changes, the rise of urban as opposed to rural America, the shift of people from one sector to another, and the continuing boom of American industry, replacing the Europeans who had wiped each other out in the war, absorbing millions of new workers, particularly waves of immigrants. And it shook up American society. There was enormous wealth being created, but being harvested pretty much by the richest amongst us, sort of like recent decades again. And this was causing tension and opposition and hostility between rich minority and poor majority. And in those situations, the people at the top find it very convenient to refocus the risk of domestic anger about them, their wealth, their having made money off the war, their having come through, having let their kids escape from the war. The usual issues of fundamental inequality began to bubble up. And so it became interesting for the politicians to keep the lid on the system, which is what the wealthy always want them to do, to focus hatred elsewhere. And the two big choices, those days in the 1920s, were immigrants and radicals. That's right, the 1920s were the time of the Palmer raids in Boston, the time of the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. Radicals who were often identified with immigrants, you know, the way Latino immigration is hooked together by Trump and others with the drug business. Well, in those days, it was criminal activities of all kinds, but particularly political radicalism. The American left was beginning to show its power. Labor unions were crushed, so they declined in the 1920s, and partly the attack on the left was pretty successful, but it was all carried over with a hostility to immigrants who were closed out by the law of 1924, but were also attacked left and right. There was also a time of trying to go back to quote-unquote traditional values, one of which was banning alcohol. If you put together the discrimination against immigrants and the creation of a wonderfully profitable market by illegal alcohol, you will understand why the 20s were a time of alcohol running, anti-prohibition, criminal gangs heavily shaped by immigrants, the whole picture, the bubble of the time. But again, the basic answer, when America is troubled, it has a tendency to take advantage in a horrible way of its otherwise noble history of welcoming immigrants. It solves its internal problem by turning on the latest immigrants, demonizing them, and hoping thereby to distract popular attention from the social and economic inequalities of the capitalist system as it was evolving. In hopes that this is an interesting answer for you, thank you again, Adrian O'Connor and the Patreon community for your interest and your support. This is Richard Wolff for Democracy at Work.